I can give you a rough idea of what I would be very interested in,
Cool, go
because
ahead.
you wrote to me saying you had a lot of deep thoughts around education.
Yeah.
And to me, you having had deep thoughts around education actually comes from kind of a three-step I've witnessed in your thinking. Like you've had that big episode on your podcast where you were like, I've figured out what learning is.
Yes.
Yay.
Yeah.
And to me, actually, and you've dealt a lot with teaching and what's good teaching, how does teaching work, etc. And to me, that's kind of like a step from what is learning to what is teaching to
hmm
what is education. Like kind of becoming increasingly larger containers.
Well, I mean, um, I don't know if teaching is larger than learning. I mean,
Yeah,
it might be the
I
other way
had that
around,
same
but
thought
like anyway, they're
as I
obviously both
spoke.
important concepts. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it just made more sense on my model. So the containers are definitely getting larger there. Uh,
Uh,
just
uh,
now, one of us is having a bad connection. You are having a bad connection.
yeah, I'm sorry. I'm doing what I can.
No problem. So, but for me, I would be very interested in number one, just jumping in with education, but potentially through this call or through maybe one or two calls, having that progression from learning to teaching to education and
hmm
what it means to understand those and what your understanding of those is.
Yeah. So, I guess. There was a moment maybe like a month ago or something where I had a very different perspective, and it felt like felt quite important thing to realize, which now I'm like now I'm sort of still thinking about it. It doesn't feel as important as it did then, but it might be still. So it's the idea that education is something where you essentially, there's learning involved in terms of being able to do things and have certain kinds of knowledge, but then there's also values. Now values is often this kind of wishy-washy thing that people talk about, but actually what values means a lot of the time is it means like what are you pursuing, or what it counts as a good outcome. And the reason that it struck me, one of the reasons I think it struck me, is that actually this is you. So in machine learning, when you talk about trying to get make a machine learning model, then there's a thing called an objective function, which basically describes how well you're doing, and it just, this kind of analogy between the idea of objective function and the idea of values struck me, because values, as I say, is sometimes it feels like quite a wishy-washy thing to talk about, but when you realize that people who are sort of trying to mathematically model some situations to get a computer to be able to do it, are essentially doing the same thing. Like essentially they have to specify like what counts as good and what counts as not good. Like what are we aiming for? And that was part of what stimulated me to think about it a bit more. And it made me realize that also in terms of educational history, that's something where I don't know as much as I'd like to. And I mean, in lots of different respects, there are lots of things I could know more about, but I think that's probably the weakest of the fields I'd like to know about, where I'm interested in, is the history of education. I don't know very much, and I think it's quite difficult. It's going to take some time. But one thing I did realize is that you know people nowadays normally talk about education in like a school context and a university context in terms of economics, as in what I mean is they talk about it in terms of work. So they say people are going to need some skills to do work, and that's going to be important for their career and also for the economy. And so this is a common feature of the way people talk about education, and the way they justify education, and say what we should measure about it is those kinds of impacts, and those are the things we should aim for. And criticisms of education often are on the same lines, like, I learned this at school, I never ended up using it in my career, so wasn't that a waste of time? I don't think we should waste people's time. These kinds of criticisms. So, so what I realize is that most of the history of education has so little to do with work and so much to do with values. So, you know, there are many periods you can choose from, but a sort of a traditional European education would involve lots of Bible study, and lots of reading of classical history to look at exemplars from history. You know, a typical Chinese classical education would involve lots of reading of Confucius and other old masters who have predominantly have points to make about what the right conduct is. You know, mostly that's what they're saying. You know, a lot of traditional Indian education will be also very religious. It will cover a lot of the Vedas, which again is obviously it's all very much about values, like what should you do. Even, you know, I'm sure that, well, actually, even I recently looked into Aztec education, which was predominantly also in terms of religion and values first and foremost. So I haven't got a full picture of this, but what I think is that the way that education has existed most of the time in most places, which should probably be a clue as to something about what it's about or how it works or something. There should be something there. I don't know exactly what. Is that values have always played a really big role, and now it's not as clear to me how much values play a role nowadays. But I think that should be an angle I should pay attention to. And ultimately, I guess I essentially came to the idea that on the one hand, there's the learning of content, and on the other hand, there's the transmission of values. And also, it occurred to me that as teachers, if someone is a teacher, then they know that they should transfer some content, because otherwise, like, they really wouldn't know what they're doing, I suppose. You know, they have got an idea, like the aim is that I need to get this person to whatever, to be able to read and write or something. That's some essentially like a skill.
Get them to Yale.
Sorry?
I've got to get them to Yale.
Yeah, well that. But you know, to get them to read and write, let's say. But then you know, if education is somehow supposed to be, or if it's somehow is also a transmission of values, or like an inculcation of values, then, you know, the teachers need to know the values. As in, if they don't know the values, I'm not really sure how this works. Maybe it doesn't, maybe I'm like, maybe it's not really, maybe if it's subconscious, that's all fine. But if it's supposed to do this properly, then presumably there needs to be an understanding of what the values are, which was explicit in previous eras. I don't think it is so explicit now.
So just maybe to summarize what I've heard you say, because it actually sounds interesting, and I think we have, I want to listen to you more, but I think we then have different paths we can take. But basically what the distinction between pure teaching, as in I am a teacher, I teach maths, I teach reading, I teach writing, I teach chemistry, and this more mechanistic economic model of I teach this to you so that you can then use it for your personal gain in the economy. And education is that education is broader than pure teaching, and it's actually about, yes, I am teaching you skills, but beyond skills, I'm teaching you values. And my translation for values would be, I'm teaching you what a good human life is, or what a good human does. And you can use those values I teach you as an orientation for your own life and your own conduct.
Yeah, that's very well put. That's very well put. That it's about what a good human life is, exemplifying a good human life. Yeah, I think it's that. It's also sometimes it's a slightly wider things about like what's important in society, but usually it's on the individual level of like what's an individual supposed to do. Yeah. So yeah, on some level, I guess that is a kind of distinction that I'm not sure if this is the best way to look at things, but it's like it strikes me how that is, you know, this angle needs exploration. That it seems like, you know, the difference between what you might call somebody being taught and somebody being educated might be like the degree to which you can say there was some value educational value transmission involved. And if that's like very, very little, and it's only content, then you could say like perhaps you would call that just teaching happened, but maybe education didn't. I don't know. I mean, with these things, I'm concerned about trying not to get too caught up in semantic games, but at the same time, it is a situation where the whole thing is very complex, and you can't completely shy away from these kinds of conversations at the same time. So I try to I get a bit nervous when I feel like, oh, but is this going to turn into some sort of philosophy where there's no everything is very blurry.
I mean,
I'm blurry.
The way so number one, that speaks to I think a quality you have is that it seems like one of the big values you have is actually clarity, and clarity to a large degree through clarity of concepts you use. What does this actually mean? And you spend a lot of energy trying to get to the bottom of certain core concepts that other people might gloss over, and that you try to be objective with your assessment of them. So that's one of the things I see in you and I really value also in our conversations. And I imagine that would actually be very much a value of what your internal scale is to say, oh, this is well understood, or this is well put.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
And at the same time, I imagine that if you, like, going the step from purely teaching to education, you're suddenly opening the field of what education, what teaching, and etc. is. And it becomes a lot bigger. And suddenly we get into questions that are not just purely what's efficient, what works, what can studies show, but we suddenly get into this question of what is a set of values that is beneficial to people and society. And with that, we get into, number one, highly politicized discussions. We get into major places where I would say the more left-leaning and the more right-leaning people will look at things very differently because they have different values of what is a good life and what is a good society. But at the same time, I think you're right in saying, in looking at education and teaching, we cannot step away from that, because whether it happens explicitly or implicitly, we are transporting value. And if the only value is, you are in this school, you're here to learn skills and nothing else matters, that's a value in itself. So even if we try to not transmit values, we will be transmitting values.
Yeah, that again, you've completely hit the nail on the head. That last point was absolutely central. That like if somebody is around you for a long enough time, and you're a teacher to them, for example, and you have a whole institution around you, then it's pretty difficult not to transmit some kind of values, probably, even if you're not trying. So yeah, I agree absolutely. I think that's a thing that happens, and you're right. Different people aren't going to completely agree what they are, and I think in previous eras there would have been more consensus actually than now on what they are, often because of a religious tradition which basically kind of dominates the scene. It'll be like, well, everyone's got to be Christian, obviously, or Catholic or something, obviously, and then we're just going to follow that, and that gives a very clear message. Well, not always. There's still room for interpretation, but the clarity is pretty high. And then, like, same goes for within like a classical sort of Chinese context, they've got, okay, everyone's Confucian. That's just the way it is, and they have that sort of scheme. Or in Islamic circumstance, same thing. Like Islam, we're all, they would say, like, we're all Muslims here. This is all Islam, the Islamic world. We're going to follow these principles. So they have this very clear sense. Now we don't, most, or at least many modern societies are not like that at all. Much more pluralistic. And I think you're right to say that things do get kind of, people differ in their opinions, and often it's along political lines. And as someone who's trying to get to the bottom of things, cut through any rubbish and get to the as far as possible, say things that are true and useful, and not just like just blah 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 for a really long time. Try to be concise where possible. Then it's a little bit unfortunate when you realize that you're actually stepping into political territory, because then you know that it's not science anymore. Like, then you know that it's definitely not that. So, but I guess what I mean, I still want to be able to firstly recognize that that's the case, and secondly, if there's a possibility to at least have some sense of delimit, of where you can delimit things, where you can say, okay, here is a bunch of things which, for example, cognitive science tells us, and there shouldn't really be dispute, depending on which political party you vote for, about those issues. Right after that, we can have discussion as to whether we should do things more in line with this or that ideology or the way of thinking. However, before you reach that, there are some things that should just be generally accepted that shouldn't be subject to political ideas. So it's I think there's room to at least set kinds of boundaries where you can say, well, at least there are some things that are solid, and there are other things that depend on your views more, and it's less solid. But we can make a distinction. I hope.
So that sounds, and I imagine that's where then when you say you need a more thorough understanding of the history of education, etc. Like, so it sounds like the kind of research question for yourself now is, like, number one, how did the different societies understand this value of education and the transmission of values in the past? Because I mean, at least for I've mostly grown up in a German tradition, but there are very clear distinctions between kind of just common schools, and then there would be more traditionalist schools that teach Greek and Latin and put a very big emphasis on the understanding of history, but beyond history, about the understanding of the tradition we have evolved from. And I know for me personally, one of my biggest influences during school was actually my Latin teacher, who was not for the fact that I learned Latin with him, because I don't remember anything about Latin. I just learned how to be very quick with a dictionary because I didn't want to study vocabulary. But he had a very broad knowledge, and I was impressed by the breadth of his knowledge. And actually, I could see the value in being well acquainted with the terrain and the humanistic terrain of the tradition you're in. So that was very influential for me. But it sounds like your research question is now, so how have different cultures treated that? But also, what is kind of the common ground of, this is just what all or most of all people see as a good life, and this is what is just needed for humans, kind of where we get from values and maybe basic needs of humans, and how can we have an education that honors those needs and values them?
That's again, you're on fire today. I don't know what it is. What did you have for breakfast? No, the value. Yeah. So the thing about common ground is a really good question. If there's common ground, that's really important to highlight, because it might say something about human nature, which is always a good thing to know about, and it also might tell us something about the kinds of rules you shouldn't break. The kinds of things like, well, if you make something that breaks that principle, actually things are going to turn out bad. If you ever find any rules like that, it's useful to know about them. So there's that, and there's also, if there are any patterns in terms of depending on the nature of some conditions or environment or whatever, maybe those kinds of conditions lead to different kinds of educational system or ideas about it. Yeah, very much. So yeah, I guess another thing is that there's this kind of tension or comparison between when we sort of think about values, when we sort of just talk about them, versus when you look at the sorts of things that economists say or economists write, and they say, you know, they end up trying to quantify everything, and they end up trying to be very specific about what the value is. So they're like, well, specifically the value is whatever, like you look clever or something like that. So like I see value in the economists' approach, because they're like very there's no room for, well, there's very little room for waffle, which is good. At the same time, like I wonder if they always manage to capture all sides of the issue. So it's like, to some extent, I'd like to find ways, if I can, to like make those two work together, of like the very concrete and specific attitude of a typical economist versus trying to capture the fact that there might be more there than they always talk about. So I don't know, that again, that's a very fresh kind of field for me to look in, or perspective for me to look from, but it's something that I would try to make contribute to this, like this process.
So basically what I hear there is the educational economists, or the economic educationalists, or however you want to call them. So the perspective on education as kind of economic transactions, and we do certain things to gain specific signals or to gain specific leverage, etc., which is not just money and not just career, but actually also my social standing, etc. That's one perspective. And if I were to kind of translate that into the more humanistic perspective of, so what's happening in my brain right now, and maybe this is inspirational, maybe this is not helpful at all, is when I hear values, I think of needs. And the more like Maslow, but also very different thinkers have really thought deeply around what are human needs. And one of the things that goes along with human needs are, depending on which of our needs are met and not, we actually function very differently and we value different things very differently. The perfect example is when we're hungry, we have a very clear value system in the world, which is, does it give me food or not? Or does it get me closer to food? Whereas when we're not hungry, we are on one level a different person, because we don't function purely on that basic need. So, and kind of one way of looking at it is that we have lower needs, which is more lower needs, I think very fundamental, but they are more about, am I safe? Am I connected and safe in the connection? Like that would be attachment, etc. And it sounds a little bit like a lot of the educational economists look more at those basic needs and looking at how do we do things to meet those lower needs. Like how can we use education for that, for instance? But like Maslow would also say, and this is just the end of the thought, we also have higher needs, like purpose, like freedom, etc. And that I think that was actually one of the things of at least the classical German traditions, is they very much emphasize those higher needs, and also saying that a good life, yes, make sure you have your safety needs met, but you also have this higher thing to aspire towards. And actually that I think that is important, and that's not just something that is something that needs education to understand more thoroughly, to think about that.
Well, I guess another way of talking about it is to say that economists try to take things as far as possible. They always try to make sure they talk about things that they can measure, which sometimes means they're going to take things a bit more at face value, which the helpful thing about that is that, again, you can reduce your waffle. So it can cut through some waffle, which is good. But there are some cases where it probably doesn't lead to a perfect analysis, right? So, I mean, one example of this is, suppose that there's a class, right? And the class is cancelled because of some reason, like maybe it's maybe there's like a snowstorm, or maybe the teacher can't turn up that day. The class is cancelled and all the kids are really happy about it, or it could even be university students. They're really happy about it. Like, yay, I don't have to go to university. I don't have to go to the lecture or something. Or they're predominantly very happy about it. Now, an economist will look at that situation and say, what this demonstrates is that they don't actually want to go to class. And as a result, it means they're not really gaining value from the class. They're gaining value from other people thinking that they went to class, right? Which essentially means like they just want a piece of paper of a degree, and the actual learning content is of very close to zero value, right? If they look at that situation. However, one possible critique of that, it was not the only possible, but one possible critique of that is that it might be that these people don't understand the value of what they are being offered. So, children might not understand the value of whatever it is, like learning to read or something, but the adults around them do think that it's highly valuable, and the children will come to understand the value later in their life. So if that's the case, then that makes the whole value measurement much more difficult, because you can't rely on the consumers, which in this case is the students, consumer is a funny word, but the people gaining the knowledge, right? You can't rely on their opinion to decide, their opinion at the time, right, to decide on the value, because their opinion, it might be this thing where you need to see it as a slightly larger unit, where it's like several people involved in this, or like slightly more like society than a single individual involved in this, or maybe it's an individual over time that is involved in this, and then you would say, actually, later in their life they did recognize the value of this, but at the time it didn't seem like it was very important. It's possible that that's going on, and if that is going on, then the economist argument is much weaker.
It also, I imagine you are kind of using a straw man economist argument to some degree, like it's a very reductionist. I don't know if that's actually how they function in this environment, but just because I immediately would have thoughts like, yeah, it could also be that they've now had school for 3 months, and it's a very nice change to have a free day. Right. Whereas if they had free days for 3 months, maybe it would be a very nice change to go to school. And then you could also say, oh, they don't actually like having free time. Like there are so many different ways of looking at it.
Yeah, this is not like the totality of an argument for that kind of position, but it would be. At one point, I watched a little video of two economists arguing about the value of education. One of them was arguing that the value of education is mainly the certification, which is also called signaling, but there's mainly about like getting the degree at the end, and it doesn't matter so much about what you learn in the meantime. And that was one of, during his sort of moment of speech, while they were having this debate, that was one of the things he pulled out. It's like, look, observe this phenomenon. Doesn't that show you that X, right? So it's kind of like part of a larger suite of arguments rather than completely standing on its own. So you're absolutely right. There are many more interpretations this can have, and not just the one. But nevertheless, I think that in combination with other similar kinds of observational argument, I think it could like build a case that there is, that the real value is only in getting the grade and not in what stuff that's learned. So, some people do argue that that's where it is, or where most of the value is.
So if we now take the kind of step back towards the education, then actually the perspective on education, or the larger perspective, would be yes. So the children are not just learning skills of which they might later look at them and say, wow, that was really useful. Glad that I learned that. But if we look at it as education, then they're not just learning skills and knowledge, but they're actually learning kind of an outlook on life, and hopefully a useful outlook on life. And how on earth would children, if we look at this like teenage children, they would learn an outlook that will probably have a net benefit on them for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. If we just assume that it is a perspective on life that is genuinely helpful for humans, or that is genuinely good. So then we would suddenly, with education and this idea that education has that element of values in it, we would be playing a very different ball game than just the skills and paper question. We would actually have the, what's the impact of a human to not gain that that value alignment?
Yeah. The questions get more difficult. They do get more difficult. I mean, there are places where I think, sometimes I think about, is there a way this can be measured? So various different things in education. Is there a way that can be measured? Is there a way that can be quantified? And sometimes the answer is probably not, or like it would be really hard. And so you have to go like, well, okay, we can't quantify it. Can we at least sort of outline its shape or get a sense of, how much can you do to try and pin it down? Because in some cases, like what you just described, it's really hard to pin down. Is there at least some kind of way you can think about it that pins it down a bit? So that's something I'm gonna have to work on. But I mean, as I say, this is stuff that's come to mind recently, and that's been that I've started to consider relevant, but I haven't had that much opportunity to go into it in depth. So at the moment, most of what I can offer is questions rather than insights.
But the thing I really like about this conversation is, and going back to me giving you compliments, which I'm sure you enjoy and hate.
I love it. It's great.
But what I enjoy about this conversation is seeing that I think you've dug quite deeply with the question of learning and teaching and what all of those mean, and to actually realize that as you get down to that, you realize that you can't look at education only through the lens of learning, teaching, all of that, but actually that doesn't make sense purely on its own if you don't take into consideration the larger element of we are humans and we need an alignment in life, and what do we use for that, and which role does education play in that? So kind of that as you dig deep, you realize, shit, this is a much bigger thing I am exploring than I thought I was.
Yeah, it's true. It's true also because, as I say, I think it's probably important, or it may be important for teachers to know, to know about the values that they're transmitting. Actually, if I think about some of the examples of great teachers that I've covered before in great depth, so I've spoken a lot about Marva Collins, and I've spoken a lot about John Wooden, and then also Jaime Escalante. So Escalante a bit less, I'd say, but Wooden and Collins both had very, very strong sense that transmission of values was central and indivisible from their work. That Wooden made a huge thing about this, about trying to get people to improve their things like their character and stuff, and Marva Collins just the same. And it was a very clear sense of like they had an idea of what a good person is like, and that is part of their job. Apart from, in one case, teaching how to win basketball games, and in the other case, learning about literature and reading and writing and stuff like that. Apart from those kinds of, and arithmetic and whatever else they're doing at school. Apart from those areas, they felt that it was a responsibility, and a responsibility that they had to take very seriously to transmit ideas about, okay, here's what it means to be a good person, and these are the kinds of orientations that will help you to lead a good life. And I think, and when you look at the testimony of the students who, in either case, either they were learning basketball or they were learning just going to school, then they typically mention that was a really important part of the impact that those people had on them. They typically mention, I learned so much about how to be a good person from John Wooden, for example. This sort of thing is the stuff they would say. So people really respond to this, this kind of this kind of mentor relationship seems to be very, it seems to have a kind of deep power to it. And they take it very, very seriously when these extraordinary teachers. So I can observe it at that level as well. That it definitely happens when you look at people who do this stuff well.
And yeah, so I can follow you. So one thing is, I think we just had kind of a natural completion of a first circle of conversation around this.
So we're back to teaching and learning now.
Back to teaching and learning. No, what I mean is, I would love to just spend a bit more time with these questions, because as I ponder this, I think, yes, on one level, we live in a time where this is a lot more tricky. So where we have much more, and depending on who you listen to, they will have very different assessments. But I think the objective thing to notice is that a lot of the traditional values that we, especially in the Western countries, I think it's very different in most Muslim countries. It's very different in many of the more Eastern Asian countries where, for instance, Buddhism or Hinduism is still very, very ingrained. So I think it is to some degree a very Western phenomenon, where a lot of the traditional values have disappeared to some degree. And where thus the question of what do teachers teach becomes a lot more secular. And traditionally, a lot of the values came from religion and came from faith, because, and this is maybe an even making the frame even bigger, not just a what is a good human being as values, but also what's the universe we live in. Like what is this thing we live in? Because that's part of values. Is we, at least for me, when I think of how do I want to live my life, an essential question of that is what is this thing that I'm in? And depending on whether I look at this as this is created by God and I am part of that, or if I look at this as there is no God, I am an accident of evolution, I will have a very different world. I will thus have probably different values and different value I apply to certain elements of this game I'm in, or of this thing I'm in. So yeah, maybe that's one perspective on where the Western world is at right now, is that a lot of things have become so secularized that it's been more and more difficult to put value into that. I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
Yeah. I mean, with the secular stuff, I guess another side of that, or another way of talking about this, is to say that there are fewer common assumptions than there used to be, or those common assumptions are less strong than they used to be. And what happens when you don't have assumptions? Then either you make things very explicit, which is kind of like the assumptions aren't there, so you need to say them out loud so people know what they are, or you don't know what to do. Because normally assumptions tell you, they help you. They're essentially like precognition. They're thinking before thinking. Like that, it's just already helped you get halfway there without you realizing. So either you don't have that at all, which is a good way to get lost, or you have to explicitly say what it is. I think it's something where, I mean, at some level, I feel, even though I do try and aim for a broad scope, there is a point at which I say, like, okay, I probably won't go that broad, because I want to, I still want to be focused enough to answer questions or to find insights. And I think at that point it starts to get difficult, because there are some very popular speakers in the English-speaking world right now who's essentially, I mean, actually they're famous for a number of reasons, but one of the key topics that they engage in is essentially like, what are we going to do about values? and they, I
I
think
mean, we have a deep conversation around that's not had very openly, of more progressive left, even to some degree far left, ideologies of anti-racism, of all of that, and then people who push against that. And that's very fundamentally a question of values that is being asked there, of what is good, what is the world we live in fundamentally racist, or is it not, which is a value assessment. That's to a large degree, this is good or this is bad. And we are fighting over those, or but people are fighting over those questions right now.
Yeah, I'd say that the kind of, let's say, the woke view of the world is, I mean, I'm not familiar with the entirety of the field of arguments or positions here. The three positions that I have enough knowledge about to be able to at least point them out are basically the view of Sam Harris, the view of Jordan Peterson, and the view of woke people. Like, as a kind of, I mean, I'm not sure if you can collectively call them one thing, but like the kind of broadly woke kind of view. So, and I would almost consider, these are three, I suppose you can call them philosophies, but from a perspective of thinking about deeply thinking about what values you're supposed to have, it's almost like the three religions. I'm not trying to say that it's all about blind devotion or something, but in terms of the depth of the questions, it's almost like three religions. Because, I mean, to try and summarize these people who work in a sentence, which might not be fair to everybody, but Sam Harris basically says if we're rational, we can figure out a rational set of values. Jordan Peterson says that we're evolved creatures with limits to the kinds of values that are acceptable to us, so we need to take on values which are in line with that.
Within those limits.
Once we take on those values, then our lives will get better. Basically, I mean, he's got more to say than that, but that's in one sentence. And then woke people basically have like, okay, we have a set of particular agendas which we need to solve, and they're actually problems facing us right now. So let's deal with the racism and the other forms of oppression that exist in society, because these are key problems that need solving, I guess. I mean, I'm not sure if you would add something like environmentalism as another. I wouldn't. I don't normally see environmentalists behave in the same kind of way as I feel like environmentalism seems a bit more like just an ordinary political issue rather than like a
maybe
movement of the same kind of feel as wokeism is.
But maybe, can I just come in there, because maybe without even putting any this is right, this is wrong, whatever on that, if we just stay on the question of values, like all three of them, and whether your assessment of the three positions is correct or not, who cares? But if we say that's kind of roughly their position, they are very fundamentally value-driven assessments. They are saying this is right and this is wrong. And we should have more of that. Each of them has that with a strong position, and that is on one level. Yes, we can then talk about which data indicates these assessments, but it's actually more than a fact. It's a value statement.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, part of the reason that the whole topic hit me hard was because I grew up with some very strongly defined values, and it's not been like, adult life has been relatively underwhelming in that regard. Like I don't, like, as a teenager, there were many situations where I felt like I knew what everything was about, and everything was tidily in order in terms, well, not exactly tidily, but there's a specific kind of joy and confidence of being able to work straight from a set of values that you believe in. And I had that most strongly in my life in certain years as a teenager. And since then, it's not like it's completely disappeared, but I don't have it as much as before, and it's partly just to do with the kind of what things people say and the way that society is, and it's different to how what I had around me then. So that's one of the reasons it's hit me hard, is because I recognize the power of that at some level. I'll go, oh look, all these different historical traditions that all talk about values all the time. It's almost like the only thing they want to talk about. And nowadays at least within educational context, is very rarely the thing we want to talk about. And that seems like a significant thing to pay attention to. So yeah.
What when you look at that, when you look at, oh, all of these historic societies talked about values 99% of the time. Not sure that's true, but let's go with the number. And nowadays we don't talk about it at all, or basically at all. What's the thing you take away from that? Like, how is that meaningful to you?
Well, I think I'm going to be able to give a more articulate answer in future when I, do more thinking and reading around it. But at the moment, one of the things I would say is that apparently somehow the historic aim of education was like heavily to do with values. Or an alternative way of saying it is, if you take a kind of signaling theory view of education, you say like education is only really there to, like, for example, make some people look better than other people, and thereby create like a sort of upper crust. It's like a way of upper classes defending themselves, or of people socially moving into the upper classes by sort of rubber stamping them with education, right? Then the way in which they used to do that in the past is to say, well, I know values better than you do, so you can shut up. Whereas now people say, well, I know, whatever, science better than you, so you can shut up, right? I mean, that would be a possible alternative way of looking at this. Again, I don't know if it's true or not or whatever, but that might be another angle. But whatever they were doing in the past, one way or another, whether it was really about trying to communicate values, or whether it was about to try and communicate a kind of superiority on the basis of their level of familiarity with like the religion behind the values or whatever. Oh, sorry, there's noisy outside. But yeah, whatever it is, somehow like the values are bigger there. And then presumably at some point, I don't know exactly when, maybe the 19th century, there was a turnaround. And, if I look hard enough, I imagine I'll find a reason for it, and I'll find ways in which that happened. It might be an Enlightenment thing, it might be that the Enlightenment did it.
I mean, I'm not even sure about that, because with the Enlightenment, there was still a very strong humanistic perspective that then arose, that questioned a lot of tradition. So one of the things I might add as a third option of why there was so much emphasis on values is coherence, like societal coherence, which I think is actually a massive driver of a lot of things, because the more coherence we experience in our life, the less intense negative emotion we will face, which is a very high value on a psychological kind of equilibrium thing. So I think coherence, from my understanding, is a massive thing we cannot underestimate. But yeah, so there was also, after the Enlightenment, so this is kind of the thing I've looked at a lot in studying philosophy. I was very much interested in the Enlightenment question. They were a lot talking about the human capabilities, and die menschlichen Vermögen would be the German way of putting it. So the things humans are capable of. And I think they tried to center the values, rather than saying this is the right way to behave. There was kind of the trying to shift it into what is it that humans are capable of, and then making that the centerpiece of whatever they were talking about.
Well, I don't know if the Enlightenment is the most important pivot or whatever. It seems to be important for some things, and I'm still trying to figure it out. One thread, like a detective, they have a lead, right? One lead I have, which is just one of these things that's weird, and I'm like, that needs explanation. Is so I haven't released this yet on the podcast. It's coming out in the next few months. I looked a bit at Aztec education. I think I already mentioned it. I looked a bit at Aztec education, right? And the funny thing about Aztec education, so this is all pre-Columbian, as in pre-Columbus. So we're talking several centuries before the Enlightenment, you know, let alone many centuries before kind of universal, even primary education in many European countries. They actually had a universal education system. They had a universal education system, boys and girls, in the Aztec Empire. And for me, the question is like, why did, because like we actually have some sort of date when the emperor said, you know what we need? An education system. And he like just installed it. And I was like, I kind of want to think about like, why did that happen? Like, why did they need it? You know, because that's a very out there society. You know, it's not connected with Eurasia. But they did, so they have felt a need for it, and you know that means they didn't transport. They didn't go like, oh, I see. Look at all those Greeks having schools. We should try that. It's not like they borrowed this idea. They like made it up independently, and they decided to spread it to the entire society for free. Like, what is that about? Like that is, I don't know, and you know, that's something I'm hoping I will get some sort of answer to it in time.
Yeah, maybe a good question to take with you.
Yeah.
Like, what on earth? Yeah.
Okay.
So I think maybe this is actually a good place to just end this recording. Like, what happened there? We don't know.
We don't know.
But yeah, I'm super interested. I would love to just stay in touch as you also think this through, because I think my personal work is much more on that level, like is very much on the values, good life, what does that mean kind of level, and then kind of looking at teaching and learning more as, okay, so how does that tie into the places where people are disconnected from their values and where people have all of these old programs running that actually keep them away from their needs. So that's a lot more my work. So I find it really fascinating to see that you're kind of slipping into there right now.
I tried just thinking my way through a few points the other day, and I realized how this can be a convoluted minefield, and you need to try and keep connection with like concrete things as much as you can, to not just like float off on a cloud. Because what I was thinking is like, okay, so does that mean that the school, okay, inculcates content and also changes values? And values from an economics point of view would be called preferences. That's the way an economist would call it. They just say preferences. So what do you prefer, right? And then, okay, you can have a preference for an ice cream or a salad, right? Now, if I am a teacher and somehow I change your preference from ice cream to salad, maybe I did that because I made you realize that actually salad is going to be less like unhealthy for you. And so it's tapping into something that you believe about health. But maybe all I did is I convinced you salad tastes good. Now that's now like, you know, it's like the level at which it operates is different, but on the surface it looks the same. And it makes the whole thing really hard, because now I've like somehow created like values on top of other values. It's like there's a value of eating tasty things, which is presumably less important than the value of being healthy, but like who knows?
And if we actually connect values, so one of the things would be, how much do we change values? Like, is it possible? How much is it possible to change values? That would actually be a widely discussed question in the field of psychology. Like,
a very important question and very difficult question.
Yeah, there are some people who would say we can't really change values, but we can realign our values, and not in the sense of they are suddenly different, but we connect them to different things. And so there are different perspectives, different answers from psychology. But the thing I come to actually when I hear your question of like, what do you value, salad or ice cream? It again comes down to there are a lot of small steps in that. Like, number one, how do I perceive salad? How do I perceive ice cream? Which would go right into the whole Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson woke thing of when we look at this situation, what do we see? Do we see rational behavior? Do we see racism? Do we see an idea of how human nature works? To just stay with your characterization, like based on what we see, what is our kind of our inner hierarchy of what things are most important, and how much of that has to do with the things I'm exposed to. And I think if I look at idealistically at an education and a value-based education, it would be, how can I align my thinking with the actual human capacities and human needs, and how like well aligned are those things? But again, that would be a whole question in itself, because then we suddenly get into questions like, okay, so what is a human being? What is a society? What's a good society? Is this society better than that society? Because as soon as we are in values, we are also in the field of judgment and of saying this is better than that. And that's a whole can of worms. But
I think the main reason it's a can of worms is actually because most of the time it's an assumption. So most of the time you don't have to think about it. Like, doing better on your math test is better than doing worse on your math test. Easy. Everyone already believed that in the first place. But if suddenly that becomes a question, then you're in tough territory, because like, how are you going to actually justify that? You were just assuming it before.
Yes, exactly. And that may be actually why on one level I love these questions, is because I think I've had a lot of those places in my own life where I've taken things everybody takes for granted, and I'm like, nah, and or things I've taken for granted, and just go like, is that really true? Like, so that's been a huge part of my life. But so I know how fucking weird that is, but also how important it is, and how important it is as a society to have a sense of to actually think about, are all values equally? Like, are there certain values that align better with human nature? Are there some values that are more supportive of having a functional society than others? And those are things we should ask, and we should consider very deeply.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of people say question your assumptions, which is fair. The other side of the coin is to value the fact that you have assumptions. So assumptions are great because they make everything easier. Everything's so much easier. The reason you need to sometimes question them is because you need to recognize if they're broken, because if they're broken, you can fix them and it makes things better. But that doesn't mean that you should always that you should be conscious of them all the time. Like, you're only conscious of them to fix them. Right. But then having assumptions is great, because everything goes so much more smoothly, as long as the assumptions aren't like terrible. Because if they're terrible, then actually you're just like, of course you're going to do things wrong. Which people spend more time criticizing assumptions as an idea than they spend realizing the value of not having to literally think about everything all the time.
Yeah. And then we get back to, are your assumptions aligned with your values? Are your values aligned with your needs? And then we kind of have this line of questioning. And yeah, very interesting. For me, that's my main area of work, is that I think a lot of people run around with assumptions that they've picked up long ago and that are very deeply unconscious, because they were usually kind of the water they were swimming in. Yeah. And those assumptions actually are they're not unconscious, because my understanding of the unconscious is not, oh, I had to bury that like Freudian unconscious, but it's so deeply in my bones that I don't even know that the world could be different. And being able to make those assumptions conscious so we can change some of those is very profound work. And it's not easy. It's quite challenging. Like even becoming aware of the assumptions in theories is not easy, much less than in our own kind of system. But
absolutely.
But yeah, so that connection, I love taking that away of this. What are the programs or assumptions you're running? How are they connected to your values, and how are your values connected to your needs? I actually find that a pretty, at least in my own thinking, that's an elegant way of connecting things for me. So end of conversations too.
Yeah, I think that'll do, because it's nicely wrapped up.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You never know what's around the